Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. We are going to discuss the module on comparative social and political philosophy. This module is written by Dr. Akash Singh Rathore. One way to begin discussing this module is to look at the very definition of political theory. What do we do in political theory? Political theory is a particular form of word-dependent systematic reflection on any of the following. The first one is the collective power to take decisions about the good life of a community. 2, the mechanisms by which power is exercised by one group over the other. And 3, the use of state power for the good of the community. 4th, the use of the state by one group to exercise power over another. 5, on the values by which a particular community governs its life. And lastly, there can be a grand political theory that reflects on the general conditions of whole of humankind or the values by which humanity may be governed. So all these senses or aspects are covered in political theory. Let us begin with John Rawls and his idea of political theory. Rawls endorses what is called as the ideal theory in the sense of strict compliance as opposed to partial compliance theory. And it should examine the principles of justice that would regulate a well-ordered society. That is the reason why Rawls, in his book, A Theory of Justice, takes this massive task of both using utilitarianism and contract theories along with Kant and others. So for Rawls, political theory proposes an ideal state, an ideal normative package, and that would be a comprehensive one and not a piecemeal one. In doing political theory like this, Rawls assumes that everyone is presumed to act justly and to do his part in upholding just institutions. That is the major focus of Rawls. The comprehensiveness, which is crucial to Rawls, does not allow a partial treatment of issues in theory. Now, in other words, he would not think that political theory looks at the immediate problems, the pressing problems, the urgent problems of everyday life, and not take the general and overall perspective on the large aspects of both human being and society. So many people argued, looking at Rawls' political theory, that Rawls emphasizes more on the normative aspect of than the descriptive or factual aspect of the society. In other words, Rawls is interpreted as facing emphasis on the art aspect of political theory rather than the ease aspect of it. Factual domain did not receive as much treatment in Rawls as the normative domain did. So you have one interpretation of a political theory from Rawls where the emphasis is on the normative aspect of it or on the general and comprehensive nature rather than factual and piecemeal treatment to the social or political problems. In contrast to Rawls' insistence on the ideal theory, Jamaican-born Canadian philosopher Charles Wright Mills persuasively argued that Rawls-inspired political philosophy has tended to model human beings, human capacities, interactions, institutions, and society in an ideal manner, and has not explored how divergent this is from actual realities, the actual working of injustice. In other words, it's very clear from Mill's intervention that Rawls gave emphasis to ideal situations and did not pay enough attention to the actual conditions. This goes back to the age-old controversy between ease and art. While Rawls seems to be emphasizing the art aspect of political theory, Mill seems to be reminding about the importance of the ease aspect of or the factual domain of political theory. Mill goes even further to propose that ideal theory is ideological, by which he means a distortional complex of ideals, values, norms, and beliefs that reflect the non-representative interest and experiences of a small minority of the national population, middle to upper class white males who are hugely overrepresented in the professional theory population. Now let us look at this argument more closely. What Mill seems to be pointing out is that if you propose an ideal, if you preoccupy with the ideal aspect of theory, then the population that for which this theory is intended has a serious issue. This has a serious implications to the understanding of actual society. That is, if you take the ideal theory into consideration, then in a population of a society, there will be very few people who would be closer to the ideal. In other words, this will leave that few people getting represented in the ideal theory, and this leaves out the large majority of people who are not closer to the ideal theory. So Mill seems to be pointing out that this leads to some kind of hierarchical society where only one aspect or a very minuscule part of the society gets represented, leaving out a large majority of people. This, according to Mill, is because the ideal theory, for instance in Rawls, has not paid attention to actual data, actual facts, actual human beings who are part of that society. Extending Mill, one could say that there is a different kind of hierarchy that comes onto the table if you follow Rawls and his obsession with ideal theory. So this is the point that one could look at in Mill's intervention, particularly in his critique of Rawls. According to Mills, once this ideological aspect is exposed, that is, if you expose this aspect of the unevenness of the representation, it becomes clear why such a patently deficient, clearly counterfactual and counterproductive approach to issues of rights and wrong, justice and injustice has been so dominant for decades. So you find in Mill's intervention on Rawls' political theory that it does not sufficiently represent, it is not sufficiently egalitarian enough, despite the fact that Rawls stands for equality, freedom, and things like that. So, critics of the dominant tradition of political theory, that is, Rawlsian liberalism, along with the advent of globalization, have led social and political philosophers towards the view that social and political philosophy should not quarantine itself from the world of social and political realities, but instead must remain attentive to the burning issues of our time. So, Mill and others like Mill seems to be suggesting that there should be close relation between facts and values, ideals and actualities. They would even say that our ideals should come from our facts. So they would argue that art should be derived from is rather than being quarantined from is, which is what seems to be emanating following Rawls. One could look at how, for instance, to achieve this balance, social and political philosophers should be willing to enlarge their horizon of engagement. They should be comparative and take into consideration the global and also cross-cultural aspects into consideration. The term for this orientation is what is called as comparative social and political philosophy. That's the background to this module. Comparative social and political philosophy aims to take globalization seriously. And the reason why it takes globalization seriously is globalization is not about a particular community, but has to necessarily factor different communities, different cultural groups, different nations seriously. And comparative social political philosophy should remain sensitive to the proximity of these different cultures. Comparative social political philosophy is not to impose a universal form onto a diverse phenomena, but be sensitive to it. From the point of view of the comparative social and political philosophy, the imaginative horizon represented in the history of social and political thought from Plato to Rawls is no longer sufficient. That is, in other words, if you take only the Plato to Rawls into account, that would only cover one strand, though dominant strand, of political philosophy. It will not account for cross-section of theories that are available all over the world. So the emphasis on the Anglophone social and political philosophy all over the world is what has to be given up, and also you should include other works. And for instance, one inevitably finds the works like Will Kymlicka's well-known book Contemporary Political Philosophy, an introduction, Godin and Petit's now classic anthology of contemporary political philosophy. Now, in these books, for instance, there is a total lack of international representation. For example, French thought receives about 5 pages of attention out of the book of some 770 pages by means of an excerpt from Foucault. Similarly, German thought receives about 5 pages of attention through an excerpt from Habermas. And more predictably, the only Indian name to appear is that of Amartya Sen. Everyone's involved and every other topic is Anglo-American. So from the other side of the Atlantic, the same kind of imbalance is evident. For instance, there is this German volume, Politische Philosophie des 20, Political Philosophy of the 20th Century. It is an exclusive as the Anglo-American ones. French thought appears in about 15 pages in a book of 325 pages through a chapter on Raymond Aron. Ironically, that is, it is ironic when juxtaposed with their Godin and Petite volume, where Anglo-American philosophy gets a chapter of only about 20 pages. Needless to add, even Amartya Sen does not make an appearance in these two volumes. The remaining 300 pages go to Germans, but neither do they feel compelled to deline the title of the book in any way by the addition of the adjective German or even Western. It is still called political philosophy or comparative political philosophy. The situation is precisely the same for a recent French book, La Pensée politique, political thought, which features almost exclusively French political philosophers without any compunction to add the adjective French to the title. So now we find that this will not work, that neither the Anglo-Saxon or nor the American nor the European of either German or French, without factoring to the global scenario the cross-cultural aspects that come from various cultures and regions, without representing them, you cannot have the general titles and include only representations from one region or so. Okay, so it is in this context we need to take into consideration the demographic changes and diversity required, updating the social and political literature to accommodate these changes. There is a need to become more plural, and this is important because in a global scenario where the other countries are becoming important players in the both economy and the national scenario, so we need to have the representation from these cultures. So when you have these things, then we will be having more comprehensive, more inclusive representation, and we will be able to understand the scene better. It will be more bit crowded, but then it also will be richly comparative. The reason for this is that the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American can understand what is happening in Asian societies better, and Asian societies were already into understanding what is happening in the Western world. So it is against this background, let us look at what is happening in India, and how did India react to this not very comprehensive representation of a political theory. There are three generations of current Indian thought. The first one is the modernist versus anti-modernist opposition. The second one is after modern, postmoderns who lean towards the post-colonial ideas versus those sympathetic to Anglo-American issues and styles of thought. And then you have the third group of people who have put emphasis on decolonizing thinking, and they emphasized on the native, the indigenous, vernacular Indian thought. The first generation were the first to formulate systems of thought breaking free from the recapitulation of the ideas of the pantheon of freedom fighters whose thought and labor had contributed to India achieving independence in 1947. This generation includes scholars like J.N. Mohanty and Rajani Kothare, and they were the first to articulate normative, social and political ideas, both evoking the distinctive character of Indian thought while also attempting to surpass it and step comfortably into the secular modern. It is the central preoccupation with which really characterized their thought. Alongside this group of people, you have the anti-modernist proponents of resurrecting the tradition. These are the people who not only pointed out the important aspects of India, but also they wanted to revive tradition. The scholars who undertook job include V.P. Verma or G.P. Singh, who did not see free India as a modernist did. They saw it as a laboratory for decontextualizing the context of transatlantic social and political theory, incorporating them to India and recontextualizing these Western forms by filling them within Indian content. The second group rather rejected derivative thought, linked the spread of the dominant liberal ideas with the traumatic imposition of colonial modernity, and often romantically longed for that former wonder that was India. Then there was this third group of scholars who catalyzed the passage from this first generation to the coming second generation. This is the initial period of subaltern studies exemplified by Ranajit Guha's early 1980 writings and the era of prolific scholarship in the wake of Edward Said's Orientalism. The work appearing in this transitional period was crucial for the emergence of the next generation of Indian social and political theory, and that, for instance, an important work during this period is Partha Chatterjee's book Nationalist Thought and a Colonial World, a Derivative Discourse, which altered the terms of discourse and inaugurated a very higher self-reflexivity in Indian theoretical writings. The second generation emerged in 1985 with the coincidental publication of three important texts. One in India, that is by Ashish Nandi. The work is an anti-secularist manifesto. One simultaneously in India and the US is by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? And the one in US alone is by Homi Bhabha, that is Science Taken for Wonders. Each of these works was preoccupied with questions of a comparative nature, showing profound dissatisfaction with the dominant views of social and political philosophy radiating out from transatlantic scholarship. This rise of postmodernist, post-colonial thought set off a series of new studies presenting alternative, hybridist accounts of themes in social and political thought in an attempt to challenge dominant concepts in Anglo-American social and political theory and to undermine the geographics of power they were understood to represent. These studies made people to rethink about Indian democracy, as is evident in the works of Rajani Kothari, or to rethink about Indian take on secularism, as is evident in the works of T.N. Madan and Ashish Nandi, or to rethink how the civil society functions in India in the works of Partha Chatterjee. This generation expressed dissatisfaction with recontextualization and instead undertook process of reconceptualization or revising meanings, teasing out the inherent ambiguities of concepts and categories of transatlantic social and political thought, earlier assumed to be universally valid and applicable. Through the contemporary generation of Indian social and political philosophy was inspired by the richness of these debates. It takes its starting point in a program of deconceptualization, that is, the project not of modifying but of abandoning the dominant vocabulary altogether. Its overriding concern is that of Swaraj or authenticity. In place of the current lexicon of social and political philosophy, the current generation seeks to retrieve and uncover the indigenous conceptualizations, terms and categories of Indian social and political thought to find and follow its logic. Previously, it is too often ensured that Indian social and political philosophy was realized as a derivative discourse incapable of addressing the realities of the ground situation as they seem to represent themselves. In this respect, contemporary Indian social political philosophy has been integral to the development of and has an inspiration for comparative social and political philosophy around the world. So there are many academic scholars now who argue that comparative social and political philosophy points us towards a more genuine universalism, that comparative thought supports global, deliberative and communicative democracy and entails a mutually transforming learning process, that the discipline can be liberating momentum in political liberalism. It is hoped that it can interrupt academic satisfaction and complacency in the face of a deeply troubled world, that it can even add to the idea of just global peace, that is, a dialogue of rather than a clash of civilizations. Now, let us look at some of the important forms of political philosophy. Now, these are very clearly stated by Andrew March. He says the following: 1. Normative political philosophy, in search of justifiable terms, beliefs, policies, or institutions, whether analytic, critical, or historical traditional. 2. Critical analysis and interpretation, which in some way or another aims at exposing the hidden, denied, unrecognized, or unacknowledged, the visible, the apparent, or the hegemonic. The history of political thought, including intellectual history and the study of important thinkers. And 4. Conceptual analysis at the intersection of philosophy, intellectual history, and social sciences. The study of forms of political thought and speech at the intersection of discourse analysis, linguistics, social science, psychology, speech act theory, and the study of political ideologies. So Andrew March's critique of comparative social and political philosophy is that Marx shows that what comparativists really want is to expand the curriculum beyond its Western centrism to include Islamic, Indian, Latin American, African, or East Asian social and political thought. But by deploying the term comparative bears the responsibility to actually use a comparative methodology, and that is scarcely done properly in the comparative social and political philosophical literature. Let us summarize this module by looking at what one needs to keep in mind when we look at the comparative social and political philosophy. The largely monocultural form that transatlantic political philosophy takes is not acceptable, is not attractive, since that philosophy is adopted in universities around the world. It does not fit the realities of the other parts of the world. Therefore, a field like comparative political philosophy can help to solve a great deal of this problem. And 2, however, use the term comparative in a genuine way. In other words, when you say that you are comparing, you should have all the constituents brought together so that comparison takes place genuinely. It should not be that you only cover certain aspects and make comparison between or amongst those aspects. That will not be a genuine comparison. Now, finally, the comparative social and political philosophy should maintain the disciplinary rigor, otherwise it would defeat the purpose. In other words, that including more cultures, more material from other societies should not compromise on the rigor of presentation, rigor of the discipline. The rigor should be maintained along with becoming more inclusive. Thank you.